In the dead of night, as Lake Tahoe vanished beneath a storm of biting snow and icy winds rattled every window, Frank Miller believed the world had forgotten him. But destiny doesn't knock. Politely it claws, it cries. A desperate scratching at his door shatters the silence, a sound half swallowed by the storm. There, framed in the swirling white stands, a gaunt golden retriever, her golden fur matted and streaked with red, two trembling puppies pressed to her side. As the old man's hand trembles on the doorknob, one question burns through the cold. Will he risk the last warmth in his heart for strangers on the edge of survival? Tonight, one decision will shape 3 lives and perhaps save them all. The winter night in Lake Tahoe pressed in like an ancient spell, casting everything in white silence. Snow, thick as wool, fell relentlessly, swirling around the tiny wooden cabins, scattered along the lake's forested edge. The world outside was a ghostly maze of pines draped in snow, the wind howling with the mournful voice of lonely spirits. Amidst this storm, in a cabin set a little apart from the rest, lived Frank Miller, a man whose hands still bore the calluses of a lifetime spent shaping wood, though his heart was now roughened by the quiet years since he lost his wife. Frank was in his late 60s, tall and sturdy, with stooped shoulders that told the story of burdens carried both in work and in loss. His thick gray hair, once the color of river stones, was kept short out of habit. A beard of equal age sprinkled with white covered his chin. The lines etched on his face, especially around his blue eyes, hinted at a time when laughter was more common than silence. But that was before. Now Frank's days passed in the company of his wood stove, the low hum of the radio, and the echo of his own footsteps on the timber floor. This night, as the blizzard raged, Frank sat hunched in an old plaid armchair near the fire, a battered mug of black coffee cupped in his hands. The cabin was lit only by the glow of the flames which danced in the stone hearth, flickering shadows across the collection of hand-carved figures on the mantel. The wind hammered at the windows, making the glass shudder and sigh, but inside was warm and still. It was a world of solitude, a world Frank had grown used to, though not one he truly loved. Outside the city of South Lake Tahoe was nearly shut down by the storm. Main Street's neon signs blinked forlornly through drifting snow, and only the occasional truck headlights smeared by swirling flakes moved on the lonely roads. The town's usual winter bustle, tourists hauling sleds and skis, locals laughing over hot drinks, had surrendered to the weather, leaving a kind of expectant quiet hanging over the lake. It was in this silence that Frank heard it, a faint insistent scratching at his door. He paused, frowning. The wind sometimes made the house creak and groan, but this was different, rhythmic and desperate. Setting down his coffee, he listened. There it was again, a low whimper so soft it might have been the cry of the storm itself. But Frank knew loneliness, and he knew the sound of something or someone seeking shelter. Cautiously, Frank rose and shuffled to the door, his heavy socks muffling his steps. He hesitated, hand hovering over the cold metal handle. The sensible part of his mind warned him stray animals could mean trouble, and he wasn't as young or as strong as he used to be. But something deeper, perhaps, an old kindness grown dormant since his wife's passing, urged him on. With a sharp inhale, he turned the handle and opened the door just enough to peer into the swirling dark. The wind knifed into the cabin, making Frank squint as snow stung his cheeks. There, standing on the porch with her back pressed against the wood, was a golden retriever, a vision of both suffering and stubborn hope. She was an adult, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, her once glorious golden coat now matted and dirty, clotted with ice and streaked with traces of mud. She was thin, terribly thin ribs visible through her wet fur, her tail tucked tight beneath her legs. Yet, even in her distress, she stood upright, her warm brown eyes locked on Frank's with a blend of desperation and a flicker of trust. Trembling violently, she shielded 2 tiny puppies, both golden retrievers as well. So young their ears were still floppy, and their eyes only just open to the world. The pups huddled beneath her, their bodies shivering in the icy air, their breaths coming in thin, ragged puffs. Frank's breath caught in his throat. He glanced at the storm behind them, then at the small family on his porch. He could see exhaustion etched into the mother's every line, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from fighting too long against cold and hunger and fear. She never took her eyes off him, but nor did she run. It was a look that asked for mercy, but did not beg. "Easy girl," Frank murmured, trying to soften his rough voice. "You picked the right house tonight." He pushed the door open wider, gesturing inside. The The dog tensed, pressing closer to her pups. Frank crouched down, ignoring the creak in his knees. His movements were slow, gentle, making himself smaller, less of a threat. "It's warm in here. Come on before you all freeze." The mother hesitated, then nudged one pup forward with her nose. The little one stumbled, nearly toppling off the porch step, and she immediately scooped it up by the scruff, carrying it over the threshold. The second pup followed, tumbling awkwardly after its sibling. With a last wary glance, the mother stepped inside, never turning her back on Frank. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the storm. The sudden warmth made the trio shiver harder, their bodies reacting to the abrupt change. The mother gathered her pups to her, curling protectively around them near the fire. Her breathing was ragged, and her eyes never left Frank as he moved slowly around the cabin. Frank fetched an old quilt from the bedroom, soft, faded, and smelling faintly of cedar, and gently laid it by the hearth. The dog flinched at first, but when she realized he meant no harm, she allowed him to cover her and the pups. He set a bowl of water close by, then rummaged in the pantry for a can of chicken stew left over from last winter. He warmed it on the stove, the savory aroma mingling with the scent of wood smoke, and placed it by the mother. She watched him for a moment, then seeing no threat began to lap at the water and sniff the food, careful not to stray too far from her puppies. Frank sat down a few feet away, observing. He noticed the scars beneath her fur, thin white lines tracing old wounds along her flank and across one ear, hinting at hardship, endured long before this blizzard. She was a survivor, and the way she watched over her pups spoke of a fierce, undiminished love. The puppies, perhaps 5 weeks old, were tiny mirrors of their mother, soft golden fur, dark noses, and innocent eyes. One was slightly bigger, bolder, tugging at the edge of the quilt with its teeth. The other nestled close to the mother's belly, shivering, but alive. For a long while the cabin was filled only with the crackle of the fire, the occasional whimper or sniff from the newcomers, and Frank's quiet breathing. He felt a strange mix of responsibility and awe settle over him. For years he had kept the world at bay, but tonight the world had come to him in the form of a battered mother and her pups, all three trembling but unbroken. "Looks like we're all stranded here tonight," he said softly, almost to himself. "Let's just try to make the best of it." As midnight passed, the storm's fury waned, replaced by a hush that blanketed the lake and forest. Frank watched as the mother finally allowed her eyes to close her body, curling protectively around the two pups, both of whom sighed and sank into sleep. He set another log on the fire and glanced around his small, familiar cabin, realizing with a twinge of surprise that, for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel quite so empty. He made a silent promise to the golden retriever and her pups, as long as they needed shelter, he would give it. And in that moment, as the storm spent itself against the sturdy old walls, Frank Miller found himself changed, if only a little opened by compassion, reawakened by the simple, urgent trust of a dog in need. The dawn that followed the storm rose pale and icy over Lake Tahoe, sending shards of sunlight through frosted windows and painting the cabin in faint gold. Frank Miller awoke with a stiffness in his joints and a rare sense of anticipation, as if something in the rhythm of his days had shifted. The memory of the night before flickered through his mind, the sight of the battered golden retriever and her tiny pups, all of them now curled together on the old quilt by the dying fire. The silence was broken only by the soft breathing of the dogs and the gentle crackle of embers. Frank moved quietly so as not to startle his unexpected guests. The mother lay with her head raised, watching him through cautious, intelligent eyes. She tensed as he approached her body, forming a protective curve around the two pups who were still deep in sleep. Frank paused a good distance away, kneeling slowly to make himself smaller, speaking in a low, steady voice. "Good morning, girl. You made it through the worst of it, didn't you?" The mother's nose twitched at his words, but she made no move to rise or growl. Instead, she simply watched, alert, yet less frightened than before. The first flicker of trust had been born, as fragile as the thin morning light. Frank fetched another bowl of water, warming it slightly before setting it just out of her reach. He placed a fresh bowl of the chicken stew closer this time, then retreated to the kitchen to prepare his own breakfast oatmeal and instant coffee, the staples of a widower's table. He watched as the dog finally stretched her neck, sniffed at the water, and when her pups began to stir and mewl, gave in to the food as well. She ate slowly at first, pausing between bites to check on her pups and eye Frank's movements. Her instincts to protect were undiminished, but hunger and exhaustion left her little choice. The puppies awoke, wobbly-legged and blinking in the morning light. One tried to climb atop the mother's back, only to tumble over the other in a tangle of paws and soft yips. Frank couldn't help but smile. The cabin, so long empty of laughter, seemed to glow warmer for their presence. A new sound caught his ear, a faint creak and the soft crunch of boots on snow outside. Frank stood glancing through the frost-laced window. Next door, the Parker house sat shadowed under heavy pines. The two-story home had seen brighter days, blue paint, fading swing set, rusting, but the windows gleamed in the sun, revealing a world still alive within. It was then he noticed a small figure peering between the porch rails, a girl slight and pale, her hair a tangle of sandy curls beneath a knit hat, too big for her head. She wore a red coat buttoned all the way to her chin, the sleeves falling past her wrists. Her eyes, wide and blue-gray, flickered with curiosity, and something older loneliness, perhaps, or longing for connection. This was Ellie Parker, 9 years old, the only child of Frank's neighbors. He hadn't seen much of Ellie since her mother had passed away 3 months earlier. The loss had sent waves through the small Tahoe community. Ellie's mother, Martha, had been a vibrant woman, known for her bright laugh and the garden she tended every summer. Since her death, Ellie's father, Tom Parker, had thrown himself into work, leaving Ellie in the care of a kindly but overworked aunt who stopped by during the days. Frank remembered Martha fondly. She had once brought him zucchini bread and stories of Ellie's adventures. Now, Ellie seemed adrift, her world shrunken and silent. Frank offered a wave, but the girl disappeared behind the porch post, only to reappear a moment later, craning her neck to see through his window. Inside, the golden retriever, tensed ears pricked, as if sensing another set of eyes upon her. Frank returned to her side, keeping his movements gentle. "It's just Ellie," he murmured. "She's a good kid." The dog relaxed slightly, lowering her head to lick one of the pups. Frank saw her in the morning light. Her fur, though dirty and tangled, shone with a faint sunlit gold. Her face was noble, if marked by hardship, and her eyes, large, deep, full of watchfulness, were flecked with amber. He wondered how she had ended up alone, wandering into the blizzard, with 2 tiny lives depending on her. The scars along her haunch and muzzle hinted at a history of neglect, maybe cruelty. Yet beneath the wariness, he saw resilience and the flicker of hope. Frank decided to try something new. He fetched a tennis ball from the basket by the door, one of the last remnants of his own dog, Bailey, gone these past 6 years. He rolled the ball toward the pups, who sniffed it uncertainly, before one pawed it, sending it spinning across the floor. The mother watched, tail twitching, torn between suspicion and the memory of safer days. Across the yard, Ellie watched with wide eyes. She pressed her nose to the glass of her window, breath fogging the pain. Frank could almost hear her thoughts, the questions she might be asking. Who are those dogs? Why are they there? Later that morning, as Frank prepared to go outside and clear the walk, he heard a soft knock at the door. When he opened it, Ellie stood there, a little uncertain, but brave. "Hi, Mr. Miller," she said, voice thin but polite. Up close, Ellie was even smaller than he'd thought, with freckles across her nose and hands red from the cold. "Morning, Ellie." "Cold out here, huh?" She nodded, glancing past him. "I saw you have dogs. Are they okay?" Frank hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come see for yourself if you'd like. But be slow, okay? They're a bit scared." Ellie stepped inside, eyes growing round at the sight of the golden retriever and her pups. She knelt a few feet away instinctively, lowering herself to the dog's level. "They're beautiful," she whispered, reaching out a tentative hand. The mother growled softly, warning, but not menacing. Ellie froze, then withdrew her hand, respecting the distance. Frank watched the exchange, quietly impressed. "She's been through a lot," he explained. "We all have, I suppose." Ellie nodded. "Me too." Her eyes clouded for a moment, then brightened as she watched one of the pups chase the tennis ball. "Can I help? Take care of them?" Frank was surprised, but he saw something in Ellie's face, a hopefulness that mirrored his own when he first saw the dogs at his door. "I'd like that," he said. They spent the morning together, refilling water bowls, chopping vegetables for a stew, and making sure the fire stayed bright. Frank saw Ellie blossom a little with each moment spent in the company of the animals, her laughter returning in soft bursts when the puppies tumbled over each other. As afternoon faded into a blue and golden dusk, Frank watched Ellie reluctantly button up her coat to head home. Come back anytime, he told her, meaning every word. Ellie smiled, a small, real smile that made her eyes shine. "I will, and I'll bring my sketchbook. I want to draw them." Frank stood on the porch long after Ellie disappeared into her house, feeling the warmth linger in his heart and in the suddenly lively cabin behind him. For the first time in a long while, he felt the spark of something new, connection, purpose, a tentative trust that began with a dog and a child on the coldest day of winter. Inside the golden retriever lay her head on her paws, her eyes closing as the pup slept pressed against her side. Frank gently tossed another log on the fire and sat down beside them, no longer quite so alone. The sun rose clear and sharp over Lake Tahoe, setting the icy world aglow. Frank Miller stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching sunlight spark off the snow-laden pines. In the heart of the cabin, the golden retriever stretched carefully, wincing as she moved. Her eyes followed Frank's every motion, alert, but no longer afraid. The puppies, emboldened by the new day, clambered over her back and tumbled off her side in a flurry of golden fur and wobbly legs. Frank set his mug aside and knelt near the trio. "Time for a real checkup," he murmured. He reached for his flannel coat and the battered leash he'd saved from Bailey, his old dog, and clipped it gently to the mother's collar. She hesitated, but allowed it, as if understanding something better awaited them. With the pup swaddled in an old towel inside a laundry basket, Frank set out for his pickup truck. He paused as he stepped out, calling softly toward the Parker house. "Ellie, want to help me take these little ones to the vet?" From behind the curtain, Ellie's face appeared hopeful. In moments, she was outside, bundled in a green puffer jacket, cheeks pink in the morning cold. "Can I sit in back with the puppies?" she asked. Frank nodded, opening the door. "That's the plan." The drive to the veterinary clinic wound along the lake's snowy edge, passing sleepy shops and the old church with its icicle-draped eaves. Frank glanced at the rearview mirror. Ellie, small and intent, watched over the basket as the pups whimpered softly. The mother sat in the passenger seat, tense but composed, her gaze shifting between Frank and the world outside. At the Tahoe Animal Clinic, a low building of red brick and cedar, the door was held open by a tall, thin woman in scrubs. Dr. Helen Monroe was in her early 40s, with long black hair tied in a practical braid and a pair of silver-rimmed glasses that always seemed to slip down her nose. She moved with calm, purposeful grace, her eyes bright and kind beneath a tiredness born from long nights on call. Helen's voice was gentle but brisk, a tone that put anxious owners and frightened animals alike at ease. "Good morning, Frank. Who have you brought for me today?" Frank explained his words, stumbling a little with worry. Ellie hovered close, cradling a puppy, as Dr. Monroe knelt beside her. Helen examined the mother first. She ran her hands expertly over the dog's ribs, then gently inspected her ears, mouth, and paws. "She's underweight, severely so. Some old scars see here, and a couple of newer ones, likely from scraping through brush or maybe even barbed wire. I'd guess she's been on her own for a while." Dr. Monroe's tone softened. "But she's a fighter. She hasn't given up." Ellie frowned gently, touching the mother's flank. "Will she get better?" "Yes," Helen said firmly, "with rest food and a lot of care." Next, she checked the puppies. The larger one, bolder with a faint white patch on its nose, squirmed and licked her finger. The smaller, more timid pup huddled close, shivering. "They're both dehydrated and underweight, but their reflexes are good." She smiled reassuringly at Ellie. "I think they'll pull through." Frank let out a long, relieved sigh. For a moment, the tension that had gripped him since opening his door to these strangers finally loosened. Helen stepped aside, washed her hands, and scribbled notes into a folder with neat, looping handwriting. "Any names yet?" Ellie's eyes brightened. "Can we give them names, Mr. Miller?" Frank hesitated, glancing at the dogs. His new charges, though, he'd never asked for them. "I suppose we should," he said softly. "Names are how you know you belong somewhere." Ellie thought for a long moment, then pointed to the mother, who gazed up at them with deep sun-dappled eyes. "Sunny. Because even when she's tired, she looks warm and gentle." Frank nodded, liking the sound of it. "Sunny it is?" He pointed at the bigger puppy. "How about Maple for the bold one?" Ellie grinned. "And Biscuit for the littlest one, because he's small and sweet." The naming ceremony seemed to brighten the room. Even Dr. Monroe smiled, standing straighter. She handed Frank a list of instructions: high-calorie food for Sunny, frequent small feedings for the puppies, and a warning to keep them warm. She gave Ellie a pack of puppy safe wipes and praised her gentleness. Before leaving, Helen knelt to Sunny's level, her hand resting gently on the dog's head. "You're safe now, girl," she whispered. "You found the right people." On the way back, the truck was full of quiet hope. Ellie hummed softly, stroking Biscuit's ears as Maple nipped playfully at her mitten. Frank glanced at Sunny, her eyes half closed in relief, her body finally relaxing as if she understood that this new chapter had truly begun. When they arrived home, Frank carefully laid out a nest of blankets by the fire, setting up a small corner with food, water, and a few toys for the pups. Ellie busied herself drawing each dog in her sketchbook, her lines careful and filled with wonder. As Sunny settled with her pups, Frank sat nearby, a phone in hand, considering who might be missing such a dog. He snapped a photo and sent it to the local shelter and posted it on the community message board. No one responded that day or the next. Late in the afternoon, Tom Parker came home. Ellie's father, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sandy hair and kind, tired eyes. He wore a sheriff's department jacket over jeans, always smelling faintly of pine and engine oil. He paused in Frank's doorway, watching his daughter giggle as Biscuit clambered onto her lap. "Looks like you've got your hands full," Frank Tom said with a crooked smile. He thanked Frank quietly for letting Ellie help his voice warm, but shadowed by grief and fatigue. "It's good for her," Tom added, ruffling Ellie's hair. "She needs this." Frank nodded, meeting Tom's gaze, a silent understanding passing between two men who'd both lost something precious. As evening fell, the cabin glowed with a new kind of warmth. Sunny rested her chin on Frank's boot. Maple and Biscuit curled close while Ellie showed her drawings and Tom shared a cup of coffee before heading home. For a little while, sorrow was replaced by the soft peace of family, chosen or otherwise huddled together against the cold. The days after Sunny's first visit to the clinic melted slowly into a gentle Tahoe thaw. Patches of earth peeked shyly through the snow, and the lake mirrored a sky so blue it seemed to promise forgiveness. Frank Miller's cabin, once a fortress against the chill, now welcomed small, bright noises, the shuffle of puppy paws, the giggle of a young girl, the soft sigh of a dog finally allowed to rest. Ellie Parker appeared on Frank's porch, most mornings a determined little figure bundled in her sky-blue coat, a pink knitted hat slightly askew on her head, her hair wild with golden waves tumbled out over her shoulders. Ellie was always early, eager to see Maple and Biscuit, the names she and Frank had carefully chosen for Sunny's pups. Her cheeks, round and dusted with freckles, glowed with something that looked like hope, something Frank noticed more with each visit. She carried her sketchbook under one arm, and some days an odd assortment of treats, carrots, a squeaky rubber duck, sometimes a hand-drawn doggy menu written in crayon. Frank found himself looking forward to her knock. He had lived so long in measured quiet that the sudden presence of a 9-year-old seemed at first both a miracle and a challenge. He watched Ellie with gentle skepticism as she negotiated with Maple over a chewed-up slipper, or tried often unsuccessfully to teach Biscuit to sit for a treat. Frank, tall and sturdy with a stoic manner, had spent his life making things that lasted: chairs, tables, strong beams for new homes. Yet, watching Ellie, he wondered if the most lasting things weren't made of wood at all, but of simple trust and laughter. Ellie's presence softened the edges of his days. One morning, Ellie burst through the door, waving her sketchbook. "Mr. Miller, look, I drew Sunny and the puppies last night." Her artwork, a tumble of color and hope, showed the 3 dogs curled by the fire, with Frank, tall and slightly awkward, standing nearby. Sunny's tail was a bright yellow swoosh. Frank laughed a deep rolling sound and tacked the picture above the mantel. Sunny, lying on her blanket, watched the exchange with her big amber eyes, tail sweeping gently across the floor. Her coat was still patchy, but the gold had returned, brightening each day. She trusted Ellie almost as quickly as she trusted Frank, a small miracle given what she had survived. Maple, the bolder of the pups, would race to Ellie and wriggle into her lap, nibbling at her mittens, while Biscuit, always more cautious, needed a little coaxing before surrendering to ear rubs and praise. Outside, spring crept forward. The neighborhood slowly reawakened, neighbors shoveling walkways, children bundled up, and building snowmen in shrinking drifts, the sound of distant laughter and barking dogs floating through the air. Frank introduced Ellie to some of his old projects, showing her how to sand the edge of a picture frame or sort small wooden shapes he used for carving. Ellie's hands, small but careful, learned quickly. She often asked questions, sometimes about woodworking, sometimes about the world. "Did you ever have a dog, Mr. Miller? What's the farthest place you've ever been? Do you think Maple will be brave enough to swim in the lake when it gets warm?" Frank, surprised at his own patience, answered each one with a thoughtfulness he hadn't known he still possessed. He began to realize that Ellie's curiosity was its own kind of healing, not just for her, but for him. Sometimes Ellie's Aunt Rebecca came to fetch her in the evenings. Rebecca was a brisk, no-nonsense woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and an air of perpetual motion. She dressed in sturdy jeans and heavy boots, and had a habit of tapping her foot when waiting. Though she rarely smiled, her eyes softened when she saw Ellie happy. "Thank you for watching her," Frank Rebecca would say, her voice brisk but genuine. "She sleeps better after a day here." Frank nodded, understanding more than he said. One gray afternoon, as wind rattled the windows, Ellie sat by the fire, Maple curled in her lap, Biscuit snoring at her feet. She looked up suddenly, her eyes serious. "I miss my mom every day, Mr. Miller," she said quietly. "But it's not so bad when I'm here, or when I'm with Sonny and the puppies. I think they miss someone too." Frank felt a lump in his throat. He reached over, squeezing her shoulder gently. "I think you're right," he answered, voice thick. "But we're all a little less lonely together, aren't we?" The days settled into a gentle pattern. Ellie came each afternoon helping to feed Sonny, and the pups drawing pictures, asking questions, and telling stories. Frank found himself opening up, sharing bits of his own life, the wife he had loved, and lost the dog he'd raised from a pup, the quiet ache that never quite left. In return, Ellie talked about her mom's garden, the way her father used to play the guitar, the songs she remembered from happier days. The dogs flourished under the attention. Sonny grew stronger, her ribs less visible, her eyes brighter. Maple and Biscuit learned to chase sticks in the yard and barked at crows with more confidence than skill. Ellie's laughter rang through the house, warm and bright, as Frank pretended not to see her sneak treats to the puppies. Neighbors passing by sometimes stopped to admire the trio, and even Rebecca, stern and watchful, allowed herself a small smile at the sight. By the end of the week, the cabin felt transformed. The gloom that once clung to the place had lifted. Frank, once so alone, realized he had grown used to the happy chaos. The sound of Ellie's voice, the scratch of puppy claws, and the gentle rustle of Sonny settling down for the night became the background music of his world. That Sunday, as twilight fell and the lake shimmered pink in the distance, Frank watched Ellie and the puppies tumble in the grass. He understood with a gentle certainty that what had begun as a rescue had grown into a family, a patchwork family perhaps, but real all the same. The week had drifted into early spring, Lake Tahoe coming alive with the sound of melting snow, trickling through pines, and the busy calls of returning birds. Frank Miller's cabin, once a retreat from the world, had become the gentle heart of a newfound family. Ellie came every day after school, her laugh and questions filling the small house, while Sonny and her pups grew stronger and more playful with each passing sunrise. The routine was comforting, and Frank, though he would never admit it aloud, felt younger for it. But on the fourth Thursday of March, the pattern of peace shifted. That afternoon, the sun shone warm through the budding birch trees, dappling the yard in shifting patches of gold. Frank's sleeves rolled up, was sanding a birdhouse at his workbench, while Ellie crouched on the grass a few feet away, watching Maple and Biscuit wrestle over a stick. Sonny lay in the shade, head-raised ears flicking attentively with every sound. It was almost perfect. Then, without warning, Sonny stiffened. Her nose twitched and a low, uneasy whine slipped from her throat. She rose suddenly, muscles tense, and trotted to the edge of the yard, sniffing along the old split-rail fence that marked the boundary with the woods. Her fur bristled as she turned circles near a patch of trampled earth nose glued to the ground. Frank set down his tools, feeling a cold tickle of apprehension. He followed, squinting at the spot Sonny inspected. The earth was scuffed pine needles, flattened, and a faint track, half boot, half smudge, led into the underbrush. Frank frowned. He had walked this property for decades and knew every bend and stone, but this was new. Beside him, Ellie's brow furrowed in concern. "Is someone out there? Mr. Miller?" she asked, her voice suddenly small. Frank offered a reassuring smile, though his gut twisted. "Probably just a hiker taking a shortcut," he replied, brushing a hand across his beard. But as he crouched closer, he noticed a small torn piece of flannel caught on a twig, and the crumpled remains of a plastic wrapper. Someone had lingered here recently. Frank's mind flickered back to local stories of drifters or campers seeking shelter on cold nights, but it had never been a problem on his land before. Sunny growled softly, placing herself between Ellie and the forest. Maple and Biscuit, sensing the tension, scampered to hide behind their mother's sturdy frame. Frank straightened, glancing over his shoulder. "Let's head inside for now," he suggested, masking his worry. Inside the cabin, the cheerful mood was subdued. Ellie sat at the table, tracing nervous circles on a napkin. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. Frank shook his head. "I doubt it. Just to be safe, I'll check the locks tonight." He kept his tone light, not wanting to add to her fear. Later that evening, Frank made his rounds, double-checking the windows and doors. As he stepped onto the back porch, he caught the scent of old smoke, a faint sour tang on the breeze. He scanned the edge of the woods, spotting a tiny wisp curling up from behind a fallen log about 50 yards off. Frowning, he went inside, locked the door, and fetched the flashlight and his old hiking boots. "I'm going to take a look," he told Sunny, who stood by the door, her tail rigid and low. "You stay here with Ellie." Sunny, as if understanding, watched him with solemn eyes. The woods were still and cool, the ground soft with damp leaves. Frank moved quietly, years of outdoor experience guiding his steps. Behind the log, he found a makeshift camp, a threadbare blue sleeping bag, a dented tin cup, and a scattering of empty food wrappers. Everything was bundled hastily, as if the occupant had left in a rush. There were signs of recent occupation, a half-burned fire, footprints in the mud, and a worn woolen cap. Frank's heart thudded a warning. He snapped a few pictures on his phone, planning to share them with Tom Parker. When Frank returned, night had fallen. Ellie, her Aunt Rebecca, having picked her up early, had left a thank-you note in a childish scrawl on the kitchen counter. Frank poured himself a cup of coffee and dialed Tom. Tom arrived within half an hour, boots muddy. Sheriff's jacket zipped up, the weight of duty and fatherhood etched into the tired lines of his face. Tom was a big man, with an open, honest smile, though tonight his mouth was drawn tight. Frank showed him the camp, and together they walked the boundary, shining flashlights into every shadow. Tom listened, nodding, as Frank described the scene. "We've had a couple reports of folks passing through, but nothing recent this close. I'll let the department know, and we'll patrol more often." He looked at Frank, concern flickering in his eyes. "Keep your doors locked. If you see anything or anyone strange, call me, no matter how late." Frank promised, feeling a new burden of responsibility settling in his bones. For the next few days, the sense of unease lingered. Sunny stayed close to the house, more protective than ever, never letting Maple or Biscuit out of her sight. She paced by the windows, especially after dusk, her eyes scanning the tree line. Frank noticed her appetite had waned, and she startled at sudden noises. Even Ellie, usually so fearless, grew quieter, sticking close to Frank as they played in the yard or fed the dogs. One morning, as Frank fetched the paper from the end of the drive, he spotted fresh tracks by the roadside, heavier and more deliberate than before, leading into the trees. He knelt studying them, unease tightening his chest. Someone was still out there watching, waiting, maybe looking for something or someone. That night, as Frank sat by the fire with Sunny and the pups at his feet, he tried to shake the feeling of being watched. He read a chapter of Ellie's favorite adventure book aloud on the phone, letting her hear the warmth of his voice, hoping to soothe her nerves as well as his own. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Sunny stirred, lifting her head, ears pricked to the darkness. In those uneasy days, something changed in the little group. The threat at the edge of the woods forced them closer. Frank and Ellie, Sunny, and the pups bound not only by joy, but now by caution and a quiet shared bravery. The cabin, filled with laughter and love, had become their fortress. And as Frank lay awake watching moonlight slip across the floor, he resolved that whoever or whatever waited in the shadows would not break the home they had built together. Night settled over Lake Tahoe, like a thick blue curtain, heavy with the promise of secrets. Frank Miller's cabin glowed softly against the darkness, windows lit from within by golden lamplight and the restless flicker of the wood stove. Inside, the air was rich with the scent of stew and the sleepy sounds of Maple and Biscuit, now more rambunctious with each passing day, tumbled in a pile of blankets while Sunny kept watch. But beneath the calm, a thread of unease pulled tighter with every shadow at the edge of the woods. Frank's phone buzzed. It was Tom Parker, his voice quiet but resolute. "Patrols have checked the woods, still no sign of anyone camping out. But keep alert tonight, Frank. There's something not right about this." Frank thanked him, hung up, and made another check around the cabin, locking every door and window. Sunny followed him with silent vigilance, her golden coat gleaming in the lamplight, her eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the glass. Ellie arrived soon after, ushered in by her Aunt Rebecca. Rebecca, sharp-eyed and tall, gave Frank a brief nod, her version of gratitude. "We won't be long," she said, but Ellie couldn't sleep. Ellie, her hair tangled from tossing in bed, clung to her sketchbook and barely managed a smile. "I feel safer here," she whispered. Rebecca hesitated, a rare softness in her stern face, before pressing a quick kiss to Ellie's head. "Call if you need anything," she said to Frank, then strode away, her boots crunching over old snow. Frank built the fire up, high-poured cocoa for Ellie, and tried to read aloud from her adventure book, but the little family, human and canine, could not quite shake their collective wariness. Sunny remained near the door, growling low when branches scratched the siding. Maple and Biscuit, usually wild with energy, curled close to Ellie and watched the shadows as if they too sensed something prowling beyond the safe circle of light. The clock crept past midnight. The cabin was quiet save for the sigh of embers and the low whistle of wind. Then came a noise, 3 heavy knocks, deliberate and unhurried. Frank stiffened, heart thumping. Sunny bristled, a deep warning rumble swelling in her chest. Ellie gripped Frank's sleeve. "Who could it be this late?" she whispered. Frank motioned her and the dogs to stay back, then approached the door, flashlight in one hand, old walking stick in the other. Through the peephole, a man stood silhouetted against the porch light, a figure in a battered brown jacket, gray stubble bristling on his jaw, eyes narrowed beneath the shadow of a hood. He was broad-shouldered, taller than Frank, but hunched, the posture of someone used to cold and hard roads. Frank cracked the door. "Can I help you?" The man's gaze was piercing, almost feral. "I'm looking for my dog," he said, voice rough and unsteady. Golden retriever had a litter. She got loose, been searching for days. His eyes flicked past Frank, scanning the warm cabin, lingering on Sunny, where she crouched behind Frank, her body taut, tail low and stiff. Frank braced himself. "I found her lost in the storm, nearly dead pups, half frozen. If she's yours, why did she look like that?" The man's mouth curled in a sneer. "She's run off before. That's a valuable animal. Those pups, too." He tried to push past, but Frank blocked the door grip, tightening on the stick. "She's not going anywhere," Frank said quietly but firmly. "Not until I see proof. And not tonight." Sunny let out a bark, sharp and trembling. She pressed against Frank's leg, her whole body shaking, not with cold, but with memory. Ellie watched in terror as the man's mask slipped his face, hardened jaw clenched, and a flash of anger lit his eyes. "Old man, you don't want trouble. That dog is mine." Before Frank could reply, a patrol car's headlights swept over the drive. Tom Parker stepped out, uniform, crisp hand resting on his belt. "Everything all right here?" Tom called, his voice calm, but carrying a warning. The man stiffened but didn't back away. Frank spoke up, his tone clear. "This man claims to own the dog we rescued." Tom's eyes narrowed as he approached. "You got any proof of ownership, vet records, photos?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "She's chipped. Look for yourself." Tom pulled out his phone, already dialing the local vet clinic. While he waited, he addressed the man directly. "We don't tolerate threats in this county. If you're telling the truth, you'll have the paperwork. If not, you're trespassing and need to leave." Ellie, emboldened by Tom's presence, moved closer to Sunny, whispering gently and stroking her head. Maple and Biscuit crowded into her lap, trembling as the tension in the room mounted. Tom's call was brief. He hung up, turning back to the man. "Clinic has no record of a golden like her chipped to your name." His voice was now hard as ice. "You need to leave. Now." The man spat on the porch face, twisted in rage. "You'll regret this, all of you," he snarled, backing down the steps. Tom stepped forward, hand on his holster, making it clear the discussion was over. The man lingered at the edge of the drive, but the beam of Tom's flashlight and Sunny's furious barking drove him finally into the darkness. Inside, the tension ebbed, replaced by shaky relief. Frank shut the door, locking it tight, while Ellie hugged Sunny and the puppies, whispering, "You're safe now." Tom lingered to reassure them, promising more patrols. Rebecca arrived, breathless and pale, and scooped Ellie into her arms, scolding herself for leaving. "You're a brave girl," she murmured, her stern face wet with tears she quickly wiped away. Frank knelt by Sunny, rubbing her soft ears. "No one's taking you," he promised. Sonny's eyes, dark and deep, met his full of gratitude and a pain that would fade slowly in the warmth of their home. That night, as the cabin returned to quiet, Frank sat in the living room, the puppies sprawled at his feet and Sonny at his side, watching the fire dwindle. He realized that what had begun as a rescue had become a fight, worth having a fight for love, for family, for second chances. In the weeks that followed the night of confrontation, a sense of cautious peace settled over Frank Miller's cabin. Spring, that determined artist, began dabbing green across the Tahoe landscape. Crocuses broke the crust of old snow, and the scent of damp earth mingled with pine on the fresh morning air. Within the cabin, the atmosphere was lighter, as if the darkness that had haunted its corners had finally been banished. Ellie Parker arrived every day after school, her backpack bouncing against her slender frame face, flushed from running up the gravel path. Her hair, long, gold, and wild, always looked as if the wind had claimed it for its own. In one hand, she carried her sketchbook, now brimming with drawings of Sunny Maple Biscuit and their ever-changing adventures. Ellie's laughter rang through the house, sweet and musical, drawing even the shyest puppy out from under the sofa. Frank watched the transformation in Ellie with quiet awe. He remembered her as a shadow of a girl in winter eyes, always fixed on the floor, voice barely above a whisper. Now she moved through his home, as if she belonged there, as if she always had. She'd learned to bake simple cookies, mostly for the dogs who adored the taste of peanut butter and oats. And she teased Frank about his attempts at dog-shaped biscuits, which invariably came out lopsided. He let her win at checkers and taught her how to mend the fence in the yard, admiring her persistence and her ability to laugh at her own mistakes. Sonny, too, was reborn. No longer the trembling creature pressed against the storm door, she carried herself with calm confidence. Her golden coat had filled out, growing thick and glossy. The scars along her flank were barely visible beneath the new fur. She had become the gentle guardian of the house, patting from room to room, nose-nudging Ellie or Frank whenever someone seemed sad or worried. She even learned to fetch the mail, though. Frank suspected she enjoyed the attention more than the job itself. Maple and Biscuit had grown into sturdy, mischievous puppies. Maple, the larger and bolder of the two, would often lead his brother on wild chases through the garden, ears flapping and tail wagging furiously. Biscuit, with his softer eyes and more thoughtful manner, preferred curling up beside Ellie as she read her stories aloud. The two were inseparable. Where one went, the other soon followed. One Saturday, as sunlight streamed in through the kitchen window, Rebecca, Ellie's aunt, came by with a basket of early spring apples. Rebecca had grown less tense with time. She still wore practical jeans and kept her gray hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun, but her eyes had lost their usual tightness. "It's good for her coming here," Rebecca remarked to Frank as she watched Ellie play in the yard. "I don't think she's smiled like this since—" Her voice faltered, but Frank nodded, understanding what she left unsaid. In her own way, Rebecca was healing too. That afternoon, Tom Parker stopped by uniform, replaced with faded jeans and a plaid shirt, the sheriff's cares set aside for a rare moment of leisure. Tom was a tall man with broad shoulders and kind, tired eyes. He carried a battered guitar, its wood worn smooth by years of use. At Ellie's urging, Tom played and sang a gentle tune his late wife used to love. Frank joined in on the chorus, surprised at the memory of his own singing voice, while Ellie danced in the grass with Maple and Biscuit circling her feet. The music wound through the trees, bright and unhurried, and the house, so long a refuge for loss, became a sanctuary for joy. As the days grew longer, Frank found himself looking forward to the future in a way he hadn't in years. The shadow that had trailed him since his wife's death seemed to shrink in the warmth of Ellie's laughter and the trust in Sonny's eyes. He started planning repairs to the house, discussing with Ellie which flowers they should plant in the window boxes. She lobbied for sunflowers and sweet peas. Frank preferred tomatoes and herbs. In the end, they agreed to plant a bit of everything, their mismatched garden, a living testament to new beginnings. The puppies became the darlings of the neighborhood. Neighbors passing by often paused at the gate to watch them tumble and play. Mrs. Carlyle, the elderly widow, who lived 2 doors down, stopped by with homemade blueberry muffins and shared tales of her own childhood dog, a collie named Rusty. Even gruff old Mr. Davis, who rarely spoke more than a word to anyone, was charmed into delivering a hand-carved wooden bone for the pups. Community, once a distant memory, began knitting itself together around the cabin. One bright evening, Ellie sat beside Frank on the porch steps, feet bare in the cool grass, watching the dogs chase fireflies in the waning light. She rested her head on Frank's shoulder, a gesture of pure trust. "Do you think it's okay to be happy again?" she asked, her voice hushed. Frank considered, eyes following the firefly's erratic flight. "I think it's not just okay, Ellie," he replied gently. "I think it's what those we miss would want for us. Happiness doesn't mean forgetting. It means making room for love, even after loss." Ellie was silent for a moment, then she smiled. "I'm glad you were there that night in the snow, Mr. Miller." Frank's throat tightened, but he smiled back. "So am I, kiddo." That night, Frank watched as Ellie and the dogs drifted to sleep, safe and warm, beneath the roof they now shared. For the first time in a long while, he let himself imagine the years ahead, gardens, birthdays, maybe even more dogs. He understood that he had not only given shelter to Sunny and her puppies, but had received shelter in return, protection from loneliness, a balm for old wounds, a second chance at family. Spring in Lake Tahoe arrived with a grand flourish, dogwoods bursting into bloom, blue jays chasing sunlight between the pines, and the scent of fresh grass drifting on every breeze. Frank Miller's once quiet cabin was now alive with the energy of a family grown from unlikely roots. It was early May, and the air was crisp, but kind, promising new beginnings. Frank stood at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, washing a pile of dishes left over from a busy Saturday breakfast. His hair, now more silver than gray, caught the sunlight pouring in through the open window. He glanced out at the yard. Ellie was kneeling in a patch of wildflowers, her hair shining like spun gold, as she tried unsuccessfully to convince Biscuit to pose for yet another portrait. The pup, more dignified now, but still the softer of the two, sat with his head cocked, eyes patient, but distracted by the flutter of a butterfly nearby. Maple, bigger and bolder, raced around the yard, with Sunny in playful pursuit, his oversized paws thudding in the soft earth. Sunny was at her most radiant, her coat gleaming, her eyes full of contentment, every bit the queen of this small, chaotic kingdom. It was a morning of small, perfect moments, laughter drifting through the open window, the clatter of eggshells in the sink, the rhythmic bark of a happy dog. Frank found himself humming an old tune, something his late wife had loved. In the hallway, framed photographs, some new, some old, caught the light. There was Ellie grinning ear to ear, her arms around both pups. Another showed Frank and Sunny, her muzzle pressed affectionately to his weathered cheek. Each photo was a piece of the tapestry they had woven together. Mid-morning brought visitors Rebecca carrying a basket of lemon scones, and her habitual air of brisk warmth, and Mrs. Carlyle from down the lane, who walked with a cane and never missed an opportunity to spoil Maple and Biscuit with homemade treats. Mrs. Carlyle was petite, stooped by age, but lively-eyed, with snowy hair always pinned in a perfect coil. She had outlived 2 husbands and countless dogs, and liked to say with a wink that resilience is a woman's best friend. Rebecca, her own worries softened by the happy routine, had taken to lingering over coffees, swapping gardening tips with Frank and Ellie, and gently fussing over Sunny's coat. "You keep shining, girl," she'd murmur, brushing a stray leaf from Sunny's back. "You're a wonder." Tom Parker visited most weekends, sometimes in uniform, but more often in jeans and a faded baseball cap. He'd bring his guitar or a deck of cards, and the house would fill with music and gentle ribbing, the kind that only comes from friends who have weathered storms together. Tom, a man whose broad shoulders had carried too much grief, now carried lighter burdens, buoyed by the laughter of his daughter, and the renewed strength in Frank's step. On quiet afternoons, Tom would take Ellie fishing by the lake, leaving the dogs to tumble in the grass and Frank to mend a fence or tend the fledgling garden. Ellie had become the heart of the home. She swept into every room with a rush of questions, new ideas, and bright plans for the future. She helped Frank build a bench beneath the willow tree, her small hands learning the rhythms of wood and hammer. She convinced him to plant rows of marigolds for luck and for bees, and together they created a riot of color along the garden's edge. Her sadness, though never gone, had softened into something bearable, transformed by love time, and a house full of creatures who depended on her. One Saturday morning, Frank and Ellie dressed in their best clothes, a pressed blue shirt for Frank, a yellow sundress for Ellie, and drove to the local animal shelter for a ceremony that meant more to them than either would admit. The adoption papers for Sunny, Maple, and Biscuit were signed with a flourish. The staff, a cheerful crew, led by Mrs. Romero, a sturdy, dark-eyed woman with a quick laugh, clapped and cheered as Frank accepted a certificate, Ellie beaming at his side. Mrs. Romero, whose own hair was streaked with silver, had spent her life rescuing strays and understood more than most the healing power of new beginnings. "You did a good thing, Frank," she said, clasping his hand. "And they did a good thing for you." Frank's eyes shimmered with quiet pride. That afternoon they celebrated with a picnic by the lake. The whole neighborhood turned out Rebecca with lemonade and brownies. Tom strumming his guitar under the old birch misses. Carlisle recounting the tale of her first dog as Maple and Biscuit played at her feet. Ellie taught the puppies to chase a new rubber ball, her laughter echoing across the water. The lake was a mirror of the sky, and the air danced with the promise of summer. Even Sunny seemed to smile, lying on her side, tongue, lolling eyes half closed in peace. As the sun began to dip, painting the world in gold, Frank felt the weight of years of loneliness, of loss of cold winter nights begin to slip from his shoulders. He watched Ellie tuck her sketchbook under her arm, gather Sunny and the pups, and wander down to the edge of the lake. The scene glowed. Ellie's dress fluttered her hair, haloed in sunlight. Dogs bounding joyfully at her side, and all around them, the promise of hope made real. Frank rose from the picnic blanket, joined his small family, and together they walked along the water's edge, leaving footprints in the soft earth. In that moment, Frank understood the simple mythic truth of their journey, that every heart animal or human deserves a second chance. That love can be found in the unlikeliest of places, a snowstorm, a lonely cabin, a broken family, and that with patience and kindness, even the deepest wounds will heal. The golden light of hope fell over them, gentle and sure, as the day drew to its close. Ellie looked up at Frank, her eyes shining. "We're really a family now, aren't we?" she asked. Frank smiled the kind of smile that comes from a life remade. "Yes, kiddo, we really are." At the end of this story, we are reminded that sometimes miracles from God come quietly, like a gentle knock at our door, or a spark of kindness shared between strangers. In our daily lives, a simple act of compassion can be the answer to someone's prayer, just as Frank opened his heart to Sunny and her puppies. If this story brought you hope, please share it with a friend. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire. May God bless you and your loved ones with warmth and protection. If you believe in the power of kindness and miracles, comment Amen below.